The folk of Haleth were strangers to the other Atani, speaking an alien language, and they united with them in alliance with the Eldar. They remained a people apart. Among themselves they adhered to their own language, and though of necessity they learned Sindarin for communication with the Eldar and the other Atani, many spoke it haltingly, and some of those who seldom went beyond the borders of their own woods did not use it at all. They did not willingly adopt new things or customs, and retained many practices that seemed strange to the Eldar and the other Atani, with whom they had few dealings, except in war. Nonetheless, they were esteemed as loyal allies and redoubtable warriors, though the companies that they sent to battle beyond their borders were small, for they were and remained to their end a small people, chiefly concerned to protect their own woodlands, and they excelled in forest warfare. Indeed, for long even those orcs specially trained for this dared not set foot near their borders. One of the strange practices spoken of was that many of their warriors were women, though few of these went abroad to fight in the great battles. This custom was evidently ancient, for their chieftainess, Haleth, was a renowned Amazon with a picked bodyguard of women. The strangest of all the customs of the folk of Haleth was the presence among them of people of a wholly different kind, the like of which neither the Eldar in Beleriand nor the other Atani had ever seen before. They were not many, a few hundreds maybe, living apart in families or small tribes, but in friendship as members of the same community. The folk of Haleth called them by the name Drú, that being a word of their own language. To the eyes of elves and other men, they were unlovely in looks. They were stumpy, some 4 foot high, but very broad, with heavy buttocks and short, thick legs. Their wide faces had deep-set eyes with heavy brows and flat noses, and grew no hair beyond their eyebrows, except in a few men who were proud of their distinction, a small tail of black hair in the midst of the chin. Their features were usually impassive, the most mobile being their wide mouths, and the movement of their wary eyes could not be observed save from close at hand, for they were so black that the pupils could not be distinguished. But in anger they glowed red. Their voices were deep and guttural, but their laughter was a surprise. It was rich and rolling, and set all who heard it, elves or men, laughing too, for its pure merriment untainted by scorn or malice. In peace they often laughed at work or play when other men might sing, but they could be relentless enemies, and when once aroused, their red wrath was slow to cool, though it showed no sign save the light in their eyes, for they fought in silence, and did not exult in victory, not even over orcs, the only creatures for whom their hatred was implacable. The Eldar called them Drúedain, admitting them to the rank of Atani, for they were much loved while they lasted. Alas, they were not long lived, and were ever few in number, and their losses were heavy in the feud with the orcs, who returned their hatred and delighted to capture them and torture them. When the victories of Morgoth destroyed all the realms and strongholds of elves and men in Beleriand, it is said that they had dwindled to a few families, mostly of women and children, some of whom came to the last refuges at the mouths of Sirion. In their earlier days they had been of great service to those among whom they dwelt, and they were much sought after, though few would ever leave the land of the folk of Haleth. They had marvellous skill as trackers of all living creatures, and they taught to their friends what they could of their craft. But their pupils did not equal them, for the Drúedain used their scent like hounds, save that they were also keen-eyed. They boasted that they could smell an orc to windward further away than other men could see them, and could follow its scent for weeks, except through running water. Their knowledge of all growing things was almost equal to that of the elves, though untaught by them, and it is said that if they removed to a new country, they knew within a short time all things that grew there, great or minute, and gave names to those that were new to them, discerning those that were poisonous or useful as food. The Drúedain, as also the other uncanny, had no form of writing until they met the Eldar, but the runes and scripts of the Eldar were never learned by them. They came no nearer to writing by their own invention than the use of a number of signs, for the most part simple, for the marking of trails or the giving of information and warning. In the far distant past, they appear already to have had small tools of flint for scraping and cutting, and these they still use, although the uncanny had a knowledge of metals and some smithcraft before they came to Beleriand. For metals were hard to come by, and forged weapons and tools very costly. But when in Beleriand, by association with the Eldar, and in traffic with the dwarves of Ered Lindon, these things became more common. The Drúedain showed great talent for carving in wood or stone. They already had a knowledge of pigments, derived chiefly from plants, and they drew pictures and patterns on wood or flat surfaces of stone, and sometimes they would scrape knobs of wood into faces that could be painted. But with sharper and stronger tools they delighted in carving figures of men and beasts, whether toys and ornaments or large images, to which the most skilled among them could give vivid semblance of life. Sometimes these images were strange and fantastic, or even fearful. Among the grim jests to which they put their skill was the making of orc figures, which they had set at the borders of land, shaped as if fleeing from it, shrieking in terror. They made also images of themselves, and placed them at the entrances to tracks or at turnings of woodland paths. These they called watchstones, of which the most notable was set near the crossings of Teglin, each representing a Drúedain, larger than the life, squatting heavily upon a dead orc. These figures served not merely as insults to their enemies, for the orcs feared them and believed them to be filled with the malice of the Ogor High, for so they named the Drúedain, and able to hold communication with them. Therefore they seldom dared to touch them, or to try to destroy them, and unless in great numbers would turn back at a watchstone and go no further. But among the powers of this strange people perhaps most to be remarked was their capacity of utter silence and stillness, which they could at times endure for many days on end, sitting with their legs crossed, their hands upon their knees or in their laps, and their eyes closed, or looking at the ground. Concerning this, a tale was related among the folk of Haleth. On a time, one of the most skilled in stone carving among the Droogs made an image of his father, who had died, and he set it up by a pathway near to their dwelling. Then he sat down beside it and passed into a deep silence of recollection. It chanced that not long after a forester came by on a journey to a distant village, and seeing two Droogs he bowed and wished them good day. But he received no answer, and he stood for some time in surprise, looking closely at them. Then he went on his way, saying to himself, "Great skill have they in stonework, but I have never seen any more lifelike." 3 days later he returned, and being very weary, he sat down and propped his back against one of the figures. His cloak he cast about his shoulders to dry, for it had been raining, but the sun was now shining hot. There he fell asleep, but after a while he was wakened by a voice from the figure behind him. "I hope you are rested," it said, "but if you wish for more sleep, I beg you to move to the other one. He will never need to stretch his legs again, and I find your cloak too hot in the sun." It is said that the Drúedain would often sit thus in times of grief or loss, but sometimes for pleasure in thought or in the making of plans. But they could also use this stillness when on guard, and then they would sit or stand, hidden in shadow, and though their eyes might seem closed or staring with a blank gaze, nothing passed or came near that was not marked and remembered. So intense was their unseen vigilance that it could be felt as a hostile menace by intruders who retreated in fear before any warning was given. But if any evil thing passed on, then they would utter as a signal a shrill whistle, painful to endure, close at hand, and heard far off. The service of the Drúedain as guards was much esteemed by the folk of Haleth in times of peril, and if such guards were not to be had, they would have figures carved in their likeness to set near their houses, believing that, being made by the Drúedain themselves for the purpose, they would hold some of the menace of the living men. Indeed, though they held the Drúedain in love and trust, many of the folk of Haleth believed that they possessed uncanny and magical powers, and among their tales of marvels there were several that told of such things. One of these is recorded here. The Faithful Stone. On a time, there was a Droog named Agan, well known as a leech. He had a great friendship with Barak, a forester of the folk, who lived in a house in the woods 2 miles or more from the nearest village. The dwellings of Agan's family were nearer, and he spent most of his time with Barak and his wife, and was much loved by their children. There came a time of trouble, for a number of daring orcs had secretly entered the woods nearby, and were scattered in 2s and 3s, waylaying any that went abroad alone, and at night attacking houses far from neighbours. The household of Barak were not much afraid, for Agan stayed with them at night and kept watch outside. But one morning he came to Barak and said, "Friend, I have ill news from my kin, and I fear I must leave you a while. My brother has been wounded, and he lies now in pain and calls for me, since I have skill in treating orc wounds. I will return as soon as I may." Barak was greatly troubled, and his wife and children wept. But Agan said, "I will do what I can. I have had a watchstone brought here and set near your house." Barak went out with Agan and looked at the watchstone. It was large and heavy, and sat under some bushes not far from his doors. Agan laid his hand upon it, and after a silence said, "See, I have left with it some of my powers. May it keep you from harm." Nothing untoward happened for 2 nights, but on the 3rd night Barak heard the shrill warning call of the Droogs, or dreamed that he heard it, for it roused no one else. Leaving his bed, he took his bow from the wall and went to a narrow window, and he saw 2 orcs setting fuel against his house and preparing to kindle it. Then Barak was shaken with fear, for marauding orcs carried with them brimstone or some other devilish stuff that was quickly inflamed and not quenched with water. Recovering himself, he bent his bow, but at that moment, just as the flames leapt up, he saw a Droog come running up behind the orcs. One he felled with a blow of his fist, and the other fled. Then he plunged barefoot into the fire, scattering the burning fuel and stamping on the orc flames that ran along the ground. Barak made for the doors, but when he had unbarred them and sprang out, the Droog had disappeared. There was no sign of the smitten orc. The fire was dead, and there remained only a smoke and a stench. Barak went back indoors to comfort his family, who had been roused by the noises and the burning reek. But when it was daylight, he went out again and looked about. he found that the watchful stone had gone, but he kept that to himself. "Tonight I must be the watchman," he thought. But later in the day, Aghan came back and was welcomed with joy. He was wearing high buskins, such as the Droogs sometimes wore in hard country among thorns or rocks, and he was weary. But he was smiling and seemed pleased, and he said, "I bring good news. My brother is no longer in pain and will not die, for I came in time to withstand the venom. And now I learn that the marauders have been slain or else fled. How have you fared?" "We are still alive," said Barak, "but come with me and I will show you and tell you more." Then he led Aghan to the place of the fire and told him of the attack in the night. "The watchstone has gone. Orc work, I guess. What have you to say to that?" "I will speak when I have looked and thought longer," said Aghan, and then he went hither and thither scanning the ground, and Barak followed him. At length Aghan led him to a thicket at the edge of the clearing in which the house stood. There the watchstone was, sitting on a dead orc, but its legs were all blackened and cracked, and one of its feet had split off and lay loose at its side. Aghan looked grieved, but he said, "Ah well, he did what he could, and better that his legs should trample orc fire than mine." Then he sat down and unlaced his buskins, and Barak saw that under them there were bandages on his legs. Aghan unhid them. "They are healing already," he said. "I had kept vigil by my brother for 2 nights, and last night I slept. I woke before morning came, and I was in pain, and found my legs blistered. Then I guessed what had happened. Alas, if some power passes from you to a thing that you have made, then you must take a share in its hurts."